All right, let's get started. Go ahead and close up your monitors and get your note-taking apparatus ready. Okay, so where we ended off yesterday, we're going to start back up. I just wanted to go through a few slides just to kind of like overview for y'all, like how are you feeling so far about the HTML, CSS dive in? You're feeling?
I like it.
Quick check-in. Okay, there's some enjoyments. Okay, cool. I don't have the HTML deck open, but if there are any pieces from yesterday that you were like still wanting to get your head wrapped around, do let me know, and then we'll try and either bring that in through what we're going to talk about, or I'll open that deck back up at the end and do like some quick review on that. But I want to make sure that we get through the CSS, larger elements of CSS that can transition us into understanding how frameworks come into play. Question?
And just so I understand this progression, I mean, this front-end designers or developers are not doing this. You're just giving us sort of like the historical perspective and appreciation for, hey, like, you know, this is how people used to do it, right? Like there's
so HTML and CSS is pretty much the same way that we think of, like, we're probably not going to have to write like super new Ruby, although every day in the world people do. Yeah. The same thing will apply to HTML and CSS, right? Like there are larger frameworks, like just as much in the back end as there are in the front end, that help you do a lot of work. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to remove you from ever writing a line of code from scratch again. But it's useful to know what it means to write this stuff from scratch in order for you to understand what the frameworks are going to do, so that you can make an appropriate decision as to whether or not you should be using the convention over the configuration, right?
What's the framework called?
We're going to talk about that after this. So thank you for that preview, right? But for now, let's just review a little bit of the slides around CSS. And then I want to make sure you have a few pieces that I felt like while you were going through the exercises weren't as described as I wanted them to be. So I added a few things. And then we'll get into frameworks, okay? So again, the syntax when we're looking at CSS, it's going to kind of look like a code block, right? You have a selector at the front, you have curly braces, and then inside those curly braces, you're lining out what styles you want to be applied by using like a key value pair system. You have the property name and then the property value, okay? And that could be any given list of things. That's one of the things that I want to go over in terms of what types of values you might see for any given property for CSS, okay? Come on. Oh. So do these words feel more familiar to you now? We talked about selectors, right? Properties, value, specificity. I know that we didn't talk about the math of selectors will include the type, so like the element type, which means a tag, right? The tag, yeah. So you can have P for paragraph, or H1, or everything in the body, or any HTML element can be used as a selector, okay? Additionally, you have class, ID, and then like the other like inherited combinations of those. And you can also have an attribute level selector, okay? Pseudo elements and pseudo classes. Remember, pseudo element is one where you're saying like the first one or the last one, okay? Whereas a pseudo class might kind of describe more of the state of a given class, like an A tag that's hovered, an A tag that is visited, an A tag that is, what is some other, focused, okay? So those are more like the state of a given element, and that would be set like almost like a class. So that'd be a pseudo class.
I don't understand the difference between a selector and
Good question. So when we're talking about HTML elements, we're talking about HTML, right? And then in the CSS side, we're talking about how to select those elements.
Oh, okay.
So the selector is more about how are we pointing at which things we want to apply styles to. And that could be at the element level, at a class, so a bunch of elements that share the same class, one element that has one ID unique to it, and so on and so forth, okay? So this HTML and CSS relationship is pretty tied together, right? You can't style something if you don't know the name of that thing, right? If you don't know how to ask for it by its name, which can be by like, hey, you people, or hey, you students, or hey, you Alex, right? Those are different levels of ways I can select a bunch of you, right? So that's the same thing that's happening with CSS. CSS is saying, hey, HTML, blah, blah, blahs, I want you to act like this, or be styled in this way, okay? We're gonna get more into the second half of this. Layout, which you probably felt a little bit about your HTML that you did for LinkedIn HTML and or the top 10, right? When you were making those HTML pages and open them in the browser, it just looks like a list, right? It's just like this long list of text, has no real style outside of the user agent trying to help you out, right? It's like, how do I get it to look like what we know as websites with different components and different, you know, layout functionality and all that, right? That's where we're going to get into layout position and then the different models that people have generated for that to work, okay? With getting into floats and grids and Flexbox and all that kind of stuff, okay? So to remember again, cascading means that your CSS is going to be read top to bottom. If there's anything that's more specific written later on in your CSS, it will overwrite anything that already happened. Okay, so usually the stuff at the bottom of your CSS or the more important CSS will overwrite other styles. Okay, sometimes that's useful, sometimes that's frustrating, but knowing that is important.
If you started out with something that was like header 1, color black, and then you went down and said like body equals blue or something like that, then it's going to change everything to blue.
So good question. So which would win over if you had a body selector for a color blue or black, right? And then you had an H1 selector that was body, H1 selector that said the color should be blue.
No, but I'm saying you do H1 first and then body later on.
So if you do H1 first and body later on, the order will matter, but the specificity will take precedence.
Okay, so that's more important.
So there are 4 factors that will choose what happens, and the more specific thing will win over, even if it's in a different order.
Okay.
So if something's in a different order, but it looks at it at rank, right, and it's the same rank, it'll take the thing that happened last. Does that make sense? So if I had a body tag at the end or in another CSS file further down in my HTML that also said body, it will take the last one, okay? But an H1 tag is more specific than a body tag at that point, right? Because it's nested inside that body tag. So it's more specific, okay? But good question. So these are the things that are going to affect whether a style gets applied or not on any given element in your document. So again, you probably saw this, that you might have butted heads a little bit. I gave you a challenge that had embedded style in it. So you weren't working from an external CSS file, but you were working inside an HTML file that had a style element. And then between those style tags, you wrote your CSS, okay? So even though you were inside of an HTML file, between the open and closing tag of a style element, you are writing CSS. It is functioning like CSS. You might have also noticed that the comment is styled differently because it's a different language being written inside of that. Just the same way when you're writing, I don't know if you had experience with this in Ruby, but sometimes if you ever get to a point where you're writing like SQL statements inside of a Ruby like block, right? That that styling is going to look different because you're writing in SQL language at that point. Like you open a block and you have SQL language, right? So it's similar things might happen in Ruby, in other languages, okay?
Okay, so the first line is obviously like at the same point in time where the paragraph is delineated in your HTML document.
Yes. Yes.
Second line embedded, that's like, is that like at the end of the document or something like that? At the end of the HTML document?
Good question. This usually happens at the beginning of the HTML document.
Okay. So it would be like paragraph, header 1, header 3, body, like whatever. And it would all be put under, in between that style parameter?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the HTML will be there and the styles will be applied to that. I can't remember if I put that at the top or the bottom.
Style, right? Style sits on its own. That body or something?
Style sits on its own inside the body tag, right?
Inside, not head. Inside the body.
Inside body, not inside of head, okay? But this is really saying this one page is going to have these styles. Or, you know, this is the style I can use. And it's only living on that one HTML document, right? I can't refer to it. Yeah, I can't refer to it in another website, for example, right? Or on another HTML document. Whereas the external link way to implement CSS is going to allow you to link to a CSS file from any HTML document. So I can say, I have this one index.html. I might have like another aboutme.html, right? Both of those files can refer to the style.css file. Okay, so that allows for a little more modularity and single responsibility when it comes to your CSS. And you'll see that growing when you start dealing with larger systems of code. Okay.
So tag the link REL that for only style sheet or something else.
So link as an HTML tag will also allow you to link to other things. Like you can link to a JavaScript. You probably don't want to use it for JavaScript, but you might link to other resources. One good example is like today you're going to work on LinkedIn CSS, and I'm asking you to use a font, right? So you're going to go and get an external library font using the link tag. So you can link to any external resource using the link HTML tag. And the way you link to your CSS document is the same way you would link to a font document. Okay?
If we link to the font with the website that we offer the font is down, so we can use the font.
Exactly. So the same thing would happen for your CSS, for example. If you're using a CSS file that lives in AWS, for example, right? It doesn't live in your same file structure, right? And it goes down, AWS goes down. That means that the styles that you want to happen will not happen because they can't, the GET request that the browser will make to go get that resource will come up with what status code?
400.
Like a 400 or a 500, right? It would say the resource can't be found, right? So it's usually a 404, okay? 404 not found, or 500 server is down, okay? So then that GET request will not be returned, so that CSS won't be rendered on the page, okay? So that's one downfall to having your external document there at that case. But, you know, you usually have like a local CSS file, so it's going to refer to the same directory. So if your HTML is down and your CSS is also probably down, right? So they're both sitting in the same spot. Does that make sense?
There's been cases, you know, when you go to a website and you do see just like it just looks like just HTML.
Mm-hmm.
They're having a problem linking to their CSS probably or something.
Yeah.
And you can probably see that if you like dug in the background and.
Yeah. Anytime you inspect a website, you'll be able to see whether the resource was successfully gathered or not, right? You'll see errors in the console saying we couldn't get that resource.
But then let's say if for the font and window is going to return like blank, or it's going to return like default font.
It might default to the user agent. That's a good point, right? So your browser has a set of CSS styles by default. So it'll say like, well, I can't do anything, so I'm just going to make this Times New Roman, because I know about Times New Roman, and if I don't see anything, I'm just going to make everything Times New Roman.
So when you have a non-styled HTML page, it's based on the browser's defaults, not HTML's defaults.
It's based on your browser's user agent style sheet.
Okay.
So similarly, if you go on your phone and you looked at a non-styled HTML document, your phone's browser has a set of style sheets set up. And remember how we talked about here those three users, the author, the user, the default, right? What if me as an Android user, I changed my whole system fonts to like Coursera script type or something super fancy, like cursive type, okay? So I want everything on my phone to be cursive. You can do that with your phone. So that might also apply to the browser, okay? So that would be me as a user changing what kind of font or styling I want, okay? And that would supersede the default user agent style sheet. Does that make sense? So sometimes like I am like, maybe I'm colorblind and or I am like, have vision difficulties, okay? And I make my fonts always be like the biggest possible, okay? I'm overriding the default user agent at that point. I'm saying I am a user and I know what kind of styles I need. And so I'm going to change what I need to see whenever I see a web page on my browser, on my phone, on my desktop, that kind of thing. That is going to override the default browser's user agents styles. Okay, so that's how that precedent gets set up. Okay. So selectors, we went over this already, so I'm not going to go over it again, but the documentation is here, right? Properties, this is one thing that I want to go over again. So we have a lot of different properties. I'm sure that you've seen that when you were going through the challenges. There are a lot of cool ones, but I added this slide to kind of give you an understanding of what things might have to be put. So like once I decide I want to change the color, right? Like what options do I have, right? Do I put a number there? Do I put like, so these are the kinds of properties, values that you might end up using depending on what kind of CSS property you want to use, okay? So I don't have a specific mapping of like, these are all the values that you can use for any given property, because how many people went through and realized there's like at least 150 to 200 different CSS properties, right? So for every given CSS property, there's like a range of options you can use in terms of the value. So some main ones that you're going to see in multiple CSS properties are color units, and you're going to use either hex code, which is these hashtags. Okay, everybody familiar with the hex code? They're really fascinating. If you want to dive into that information, it's really fascinating. RGB is another way to determine color. Okay, so you would look something like this, where it'd say RGB in parentheses 255, 255, 255, which is I think white or black, I can't remember. The highest contrast I think is black. So any combination of these colors changing. So this is where you get to that, like you can see a color wheel and choose a specific color, and you can get it back in RGB values. Or there's like 157 general keywords for colors. And that's one of the resources I shared yesterday. You can say pink, or you can say Dodger blue, or you can say, did anybody use other colors that were weird?
Aqua.
Yeah, there's aqua, antique white. So there's like a whole bunch of keywords of different colors, and you can just use that color word, and it'll understand like, oh, that's like hex code FFFFF, and it'll just translate it, okay? The other ones are measurement units. So you probably saw PX, EM, okay? Also percentages are used often when it comes to any kind of measurement. And that's usually percentage of the window, okay? Or percentage of the space that it has available to it, okay? So that might start being like relative to the space I have, right? I want 100% space or 50% space.
Minus 50% makes it into a circle, and
Yeah, for border radius, 50%, like I was trying to allude to like what that meant mathematically in terms of like calculating the radius. Like I'm probably just missing like the specific math that goes into changing border radius at why 50% makes it that way. But I'm sure there's a really fascinating article. I'll probably research and find it.
So EM.
EM is so it means relative to the default font size of the given type on a page. So EM is utilized sometimes to be like, okay, if the font is 50 pixels, right, then 2 EM means two magnitudes of order from that one set of type. So like it'll help with the padding, for example, that gets utilized 2 EM. So if for any given element that's holding the type, right? If it's 10 pixels, then the padding can be relative to that 10 pixels, okay? And then if it's 50 pixels, the padding is relative to that 50 pixels. So it really allows for you to have more, I guess, responsiveness in that regard. And you can see how that works if you utilize EM versus pixels, which are more direct units of measurement. Some other units of measurements might be thin, thick, medium, okay? Duration units come into play when we deal with animation. So you might have something that's like 45 seconds or 500 milliseconds. And that's something you'll see probably in JavaScript more often. But in CSS, you can definitely set animations to be like, every 5 seconds jump, or there's lots of really cool stuff you can do with CSS. Or rotate and take 5 seconds instead of 50 seconds to do this thing, okay? Other things are like statuses, where you can say visible, hidden, none. So display hidden or display none can change the way an element is either shown or not shown on a page.
I'm sorry, status.
So these are like keywords that can be utilized in some CSS properties. So it's not really a measurement, but it is a status that you would give to like display, for example. So display is a CSS property, and I can use either hidden, another keyword that gets used, or none. So these are just keywords that you can use as values.
Does that mean like, so you have some sort of menu and it's like hidden until like the cursor goes over it?
Right, and then you might change that CSS property might change to visible instead of hidden. Okay, you'll see like that's like one good example of like how that value can shift the way things work, or styled a certain way.
Are there like if statements with CSS, like or like how do you determine like so must cursors if cursors?
Good question. There aren't really if statements in CSS natively, but when you utilize like less or Sass, it starts giving some like function level work that you can do that are like modular or mix-in type things that let you do some kind of logic like that. Additionally, you would utilize you would use JavaScript to do some level of logic where you'd be like, if a given element has the status of hidden, then make it visible when this event occurs. So that's how you would utilize the CSS that you set up in the first place to change when you change behavior based on the CSS or based on the JavaScript that you set up for your page. Okay, but these are the ways that you can set things up at the beginning, and then change them as you progress or as somebody uses your site. Make sense? The other one, URL. So sometimes you'll see URL parentheses. This is the URL link for background image, for example. There are some other ones that, some other CSS properties that might use URL. Directions, you'll see this oftentimes when it comes to many different CSS properties that have to do with like the actual box itself. So a lot of times like border, margin, position, sometimes you'll see like top, bottom, left, right. You can set those in as values, and not just like on the property side. You can see that as a value, like margin center for example. You might see that come into play. Okay. Styles are keywords that will help with like border. Usually has like bold, dotted, dashed, double. There's some other ones that are like similar to when you emboss something. So you might, if you've seen any of those like buttons that look like they're like popping out of the page, they might have used some kind of emboss, or can't remember the other style name right now, but those are the types of keywords you might see when it comes to styling in that way. And then the last property value I want to make sure that everybody has like an awareness of, auto. Auto gets used often in lots of different contexts, but it's always going to do something dependent on that element's like place, like where it's contextually set up on the page, and the context in which you're using it. So like the particular property you might use it for, like margin auto does something different than if you use like font size auto, for example. Okay, it's a much more ubiquitous and mysterious type that you might see in your CSS property values, but just know that that exists, and it does certain things depending on when it's used and where it's used. Okay. Any other questions about values that you might have seen or things that you might have found when you were doing your challenges? This helped clarify some things a little bit. Cool. So I already did the property shorthands, but now you see more clearly, right? You're seeing left top, this URL, the hash, the hex code. We have the pixels, solid, right? Red color code. The call to action here is just an example of a class selector. So if there is a class of .call to action elements, right? Call to action class elements, they should apply these particular styles, right? So just as an example. And then here I'm using paragraph, like a type selector. Here I'm using an ID selector, right? So one specific page title. And then here I'm using the class hot dogs. So for any of my hot dog elements, they get these styles.
How you know? Like sometimes you use semicolons at the end, but sometimes just spell, sometimes like comma, sometimes.
Good question. So when you're using multiple values, property values, you usually just space them out. And the shorthand ones are just saying like, for all the border things, there's a particular order in which, usually an order, or you know that like you can use solid for a border style. So it knows that solid is for border style, and it knows that red is for border color. Okay. If you change the order of them, they should work, but they might not, and that might be because like, for example, if you put top at the beginning, it might be like, top is not a color. Okay, so it might be the order might be important, but that's what's happening. Those are multiple CSS properties being bundled into one shorthanded line. Okay, question?
So you've like got call to action and you've got hot dogs. So like how is that? So I guess I'm now used to doing paragraph or body or like header or title or whatever. What is the dot hot dogs? What is the dot call to action? Where do you place that in CSS?
So the dot hot dogs is only referring to a HTML element on the HTML side that I may have been given a class attribute. So on my HTML side, I have, you know, somebody give me a div, right? A div element that has the attribute class equals quote unquote hot dogs, right? So then I know that on the CSS side, I have to, in order for me to style that one element, I have two options. I can either style all the divs that will include that div, or I can style a class, any element that has the class.hotdog on it, right? So if I style any class element with hotdog, then that div will be styled, but another div that doesn't have that class will not be styled. It's about selecting the specific things you want. Hotdog is irrelevant. It could say like, cool. All right, so now we're talking about display. Again, block takes all the space. Inline just takes up the space it needs. Then we have two different models that help with layout. We have the Flexbox model, and then we have a grid model. These are both ways that people have taken on how to place things in an organized fashion on a given web page. So you have a bunch of like div elements, for example, that maybe they all need to sit next to each other, right? So we built one box and they kind of just stack on top of each other, right? Because it's just reading. But what if I wanted them all to line up in one line? I could make them all in line and then they all sit next to each other on one line, right? But another way to do that is to say I'm looking at my page in terms of a grid. So I have rows and columns. And then I want to have the boxes lay out when I have all the space possible. But then when I only have a medium amount of space, like when I have an iPad that people are using to look at my site, I don't want the boxes to be squeezed together, right? Then I want two of them stacked at a time, right? Just think about it in the same way you would, you have an airplane that has a particular format that you want people to be sitting in, right? Versus a whole room where people can stretch out, versus like a tiny space where like people need to be organized in a specific way in order to fit appropriately, right?
So you're saying that's Flex model?
So both Flex and Grid model are going to be having a certain way that you can structure your div elements or your HTML elements to lay out based on the width that a web page is being viewed in. Okay, so like the size of a given screen will affect the way that that looks. Okay, so writing this out sometimes can be really, really complicated because you can't perceive how many different screen sizes, like iPhone might come out with the like, I don't know, the iCube, and then it's like a tiny screen that you want your website to be looked at. That's going to be horrible, right, for the user. But they expect you to have made a website that will also look cool on the iCube, right? So how do you anticipate screen sizes and making sure that your site looks awesome in any given scenario? You start thinking about the layout. So in tiny screens, I want everything to be stacked. In huge screens, I have the space for the boxes to be, all stacked in really cool ways. And then in mediums, I want them like stacked 2 at a time, stuff like that.
You're also doing that in JavaScript or something.
You're doing that in CSS. Yep, CSS is the jam. Okay, so the way you do that is really, again, having an understanding that every element is structured as a box, and that these are the ways that those are being set up through padding, border, and margin. Also height and width when it comes to the content itself. Okay, so how many of us touched position a little bit yesterday? Tiny bit? Okay, so if we think about position is as a place any given element should be on a document. So if we think about this room as an HTML document, right? Our positions right now are set based on where we sat, right? And where the chairs were, right? The flow of the room made everyone sit in a particular way, right? But what if all of a sudden this room got cut in half? Like we would be pushed in a linear way, like towards the end of the room and kind of squeeze together, right? How you set position will shift how an HTML element will flow to set its position in the document. Okay, it can change that. The default position every element has is static. Just means stay where you are in the document. You know, I put you, you have a div here, and then you have a UL element here, and that's where you stay. You stay just like, whether I'm block or inline, you either like give people space or you take up all the space on a line. And after that, the next person does their thing, okay? So if I want to change my position from static, I will do it by setting this position property to these other 4, and technically there's 6, but right now we'll just focus on these 4 mostly used ones. These other positions, okay? So based on our understanding of a box coming from top, right, bottom, left, okay, we would be able to set a given HTML element's position. We can set it relative. So if we set it relative, it's going to change from being like, I stay right here normally, but I want to change my position to be relative to my normal position or the static position. I want to be 5 pixels down and 5 pixels to the right, okay, from the top corner. So right now, if we like thought of Alex as an HTML element and he is a relative positioned document or a relative position element, right? He would be from his normal position, which everybody would start off at like 0, 0, right? Instead of that, right, instead of us all being stacked in one line, I actually want Alex to be 50 pixels to the right. Okay, I'm really horrible at right, left, but that's what you would do, right? And then Alex would be like, okay, cool, now I can sit over on this other side of the document. Okay, so it's relative to where I would normally be placed in the flow of the document. Okay, and then you can change those specifications based on top, right, bottom, left. Okay, and you would utilize measurements like, you know, percentage, pixel, EM. You would use those measurements. Okay, absolute means that I am, instead of being statically positioned, now I am absolutely placed in this spot. So I'm actually taken out of the flow of the document and I'm placed in an absolute spot. Okay, sometimes that looks like I'm absolute. So
center, absolute center.
So you could say absolute where like you're 50% width of the page. So you'd say absolute at like 50% or something like that.
Which is great for like transitioning from desktop to iPad, iPhone, whatever, right? 'Cause it's
Sometimes that can sometimes be the case, right? You'll see how like responsiveness might call for more specificity than that. But sometimes just putting something in the center is like, great, just leave it like that, right? The fixed position means that it's fixed to the actual viewport. So not just this document, but like the place that the document is being read in. So it's actually not going to scroll. Like, so if you've ever seen a long document, you can scroll up and down, okay? An absolutely placed thing, if I place it at a certain place, it'll scroll with the rest of the page, whereas a fixed item won't scroll with the rest of the page. It's like, I'm literally sitting right here, 50 pixels in, and I'm gonna stay here no matter how long this document is. It's gonna flow over me, and I'm just gonna stay right here, fixed to this spot, okay? And then sticky is useful for like, you'll probably see sticky nav bars, right? When you have a document that's really long, but you wanna keep that header nav bar, right? And then as you scroll, that header just stays right there. That's being set up as a sticky nav bar. Okay, so that CSS is being applied here to say like, keep this here, let everything else scroll. It looks as if it's all being scrolled behind the header, but it's actually just, this is staying here and everything else is being scrolled. The document is, the browser is scrolling the rest of the content. So it creates really cool effects. So your ability to utilize these 4 things will change the way that people experience your content and the way that you structure stuff on your page. Okay, this is a very hard concept. I don't want people to be like, I get none of this. It doesn't make any sense. It's a hard concept that people like continuously have to return to, and that's why we get into why we have frameworks, because people are like trying to reinvent the wheel all the time by trying to build this from scratch, and you can't anticipate every single screen that might be showing this information. Okay. Oh, now we're at a place where we're going to stack and float a box. Okay, so let's try this out. Should we take a break? Okay, cool. Yeah, let me set up and then we'll take a break. Yay, good job. Pause.